Okay, so we have done the notes on cotton, cattle, and railroads in a jigsaw activity, but perhaps you didn't get enough time to look at the recording or at the papers, or maybe you didn't trust your partners enough to be their experts. So here are digital copies, and I'll go over the main points of them with you really quickly. So for agriculture, we know that that means growing crops or farming, which is the cotton. And we had the question, what was the background of most sharecroppers? This paper says that sharecropping and tenant farmers are basically the same thing. Tenant farmers were farmers who rented the land to farm, and these farmers paid their rent in either cash or in shares of their crop to the actual landowners. We also learned that from our worksheet. Sharecropping was very similar in that the sharecroppers were farmers who they were given the tools and the land and the seeds, and then they had to give a share of their crop to the owners. So both tenant and sharecroppers are people who have to give parts of their crops to someone else. The second question, why did the tenant and sharecropper system fail? It's kind of a tricky question in that right here it says that the tenant system was very strong in Texas well into the 20th century because of the lack of money after the Civil War. But then you have to keep reading, and it lists reasons that the sharecrop system failed, such as drought, financial panics, overproduction of crops, and problems with pest control. So that is the answer to number 2. On number 3, you could tell me several things, such as where was most cotton grown. Usually cotton was grown in the coastal plains because that was really good for crops. But you will notice that here it says that new farming techniques and new technology like the windmill caused cotton and other agricultures to be able to be grown in West Texas and the Rio Grande, not just in East Texas or the Gulf Coastal Plains. So the windmill was a very good invention to spreading agriculture. So you might mention something about that. You could also mention how cotton was, number 3 could be what crop was the most important in Texas after the Civil War, and the answer would be cotton. So there's several options that you could do. This stuff on the bottom, none of that's going to be on the test. So here we have our cattle cards, or station, if you will. The first question was, what were the 3 best cattle drives? You learned this from your worksheet on page 16, your guided reading. The Sedalia Loving, the Goodnight Loving, the Sedalia Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and the Chisholm Trail were the 3 biggest. They were also the first. You need to know that after the Civil War was when the cattle drives started going from Texas up north through Oklahoma, North Dakota, South Dakota, and those areas. What inventions led to the close of the open range? This is another question that you could easily already answer if you were paying attention to your guided reading worksheet. That would be barbed wire. Barbed wire was basically what closed the open range, and it led to a lot of anger between the farmers and ranchers, which that part is not going to be on the test. The range wars aren't going to be on the test, but you do need to know inventions such as windmill and barbed wire. Why was cattle so important to the growth of Texas? By the 20th century, the cattle industry was how people saw Texas. It was the largest ranches in the world were in Texas. The XIT Ranch and the Panhandle covered as much as the state of Connecticut, and that's how we got our Capitol building. Cattle industry opened a lot of doors for women to become cattle ranchers and for African Americans to be cattle ranchers. So cattle was the very first time where race and gender equality, like it was all gone. There was no racism in cattle. If you could handle the cattle, then you got the respect that you deserved. Same thing with women. It was very important to Texas. You also need to know that the reason cattle was so important to Texas is because after the Civil War, the price of beef in the East went up. Everybody started eating more because the soldiers were coming back and they didn't have a lot of their crops. So they needed an influx or more amounts of beef. And so the beef prices went up, and that is why they started shipping all of their beef and their hamburgers to the east or to the Atlantic coast. You also need to know that ranching came about in specifically West Texas because there wasn't a lot of water out in West Texas during this time. Windmills helped with the water, and we just talked about how windmills helped with growing more crops, but crops were never grown in West Texas. It was all ranching because you could move the cattle from water source to water source. So there was a big lack of water resources in West Texas, and that's how we got a lot of ranches in West Texas. So you could say that cattle is to West Texas as cotton is to East Texas. So, moving on. So for railroads, we wrote on number 1, how important were railroads to the growth of Texas? Your answer: without the railroad, West Texas would not have been settled. The railroads meant jobs, businesses, and more people. After the Civil War, you had a lot of people that were fleeing from the South because it was devastated. Reconstruction was going on. There were so many battles in the South. Buildings, life in general was just completely destroyed. Texas wanted to grow, and during Reconstruction, Texas leaders began building railroads across the state to get more people to the places that didn't already have a lot of people. Remember, there were a lot of population centers along the coast because it was easy to get people there, and they didn't have a lot of people in West Texas, and they had these large ranches. So now you've got the railroad coming in, and the state sets aside land grants to give these railroad companies land. On these railroad routes, if a railroad stopped in a city or town, it meant jobs, businesses, and growth. If it did not stop, a town might not survive. This is why we have Dallas and Fort Worth. The whole bottom part of that is talking about why we have Dallas and Fort Worth now. Junctions are points where the railroad intersects, and they very quickly grew up. But if we didn't have the railroads, and the railroads did not come during Reconstruction, would West Texas have been settled? Would there be Lubbock? Would there be Amarillo? Would there be any of these towns or cities or villages? Would they have been there if the railroad had not gone through West Texas? The answer is simply no, it would not. And for your third question, you could say something about how railroads were important because roads were not so good with flooding that happened. You could say something about how a lot of population was along the coast, but the railroads changed that. You could talk about how towns built up around railroad junctions or railroad points, any of that stuff. So that could be anything for number 3. Don't forget that on page 19, you want to have a one-sentence summary of why cotton, why railroads, and why cattle were all important to Texas. Okay? So I hope this has helped you in case you haven't gotten any of the reading passages to finish your notes on page, what page? 18, that's right. If you watched this video and you found it helpful, I need you to, on my notebook, in my notebook, on page 14, on your reminders, to come and draw a heart and write your name inside that heart on my page 14 if you like this video. If not, don't do it. Thank you. Bye.